Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to next year's development discourse. Next year is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving complex development questions. We work very closely with federal and state governments and their development partners, to address these issues. Development Discourse, on the other hand, is our public policy discussion platform, which we use in bringing pragmatic solutions or ideas to these complex development questions that we seek to answer. I'm pleased to have Eyo Ekpo as my guest today. Eyo is the Chief Executive Officer at Escredite. He's a commercial lawyer with over 35 years of experience in project finance, commercial transactions, and the electricity sector reforms and regulation. He was commissioner responsible for market competition and rates at the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission from 2010 to 2015. Prior to this, from 2003 to 2007, he was the Attorney General and Commissioner for Justice in Cross River State. And before that, from 2001 to 2003, he was head power sector reform team at the Bureau of Public Enterprises. And we'll get into some of the work he did there. He was also the Senior Performance Monitor team lead at the Presidential Task Force on Power in 2010. Eyo, welcome. So, sure. So after like a decade of privatizing the electricity sector, generation, distribution, Nigeria has seen just a marginal improvement in electricity delivered to the national grid and an increase in customer numbers, very marginal increase. However, there's been a drop in electricity supply per capita, leaving the country even more dependent on backup generators for baseload supply. Do you think that the privatization effort failed? If it did, where did we get it wrong? As someone who was there from creation. Actually, you should take part of the blame for whatever answer you give now.
I'm happy to take part of the blame, of course. But the question is, you've actually asked a question that requires a discourse of its own.
Yes. Let
me quickly try and say this as best as I can. Privatization is 99% politics, 1% economics. I always say this. Let's understand this, all right? Because what you are doing in almost every case is determining who to transfer a major public asset, usually a monopoly asset, right? And no matter how objective we want to be, no matter how straightforward and honest we want to be, it's a political decision who you hand that asset to.
Correct.
Right? For whatever reason, by whatever process, because that person or that entity, that group of persons under some corporate name or the other, it's always some individuals. And you look at them and decide, do I want this national asset to go to these hands? Whether it's in your personal interest or it's in the national interest, it will be a political decision. So let's have that in our minds. That being said, privatization itself is in two parts. There's a process, right? And then the process is expected to deliver a certain outcome. In the case of Nigeria, the outcomes that we wanted have been laid out or were laid out in the National Electric Power Policy of 2001. Essentially, 2 or 3 phrases: universal access, reliable access for all Nigerians, for the greatest number of Nigerians. So with that second statement in mind, I would look at process very quickly and say that the process was successful.
Okay.
Right? Because it produced an outcome.
Okay.
Now, the process itself, if we recall, was actually as open and as transparent as you could want it.
Okay.
Adverts were put out, people responded, they were evaluated, they were asked to submit bids, and the bids were not market value bids.
Okay.
If there are market value bids, we would have got bids like 1 naira.
Okay.
All right, because the entire sector was technically insolvent.
Correct.
At the time, right? Still is, by the way, but that's a different question.
We'll get to that.
So you could have said that, if I want to ask for a market value, it would be 1 naira, in which case we would have been accused. And I'm saying we because I was part of that process in NEC. I was a member of the NCP's power subcommittee as a representative of NEC. I represented NEC on the NCP committee. So we would have then been accused of selling the family silver to our friends, no matter how capable those people were. So the basis that was set up for determining value was the regulatory asset base of each of the entities. Market value, I think, was the case for the generation side, but for the distribution side, it wasn't market value at all. It was the value of the RAB as determined by NEC. So it wasn't something plucked from the air. We had already done that valuation long before the privatization, because it was the basis for determining the tariffs. All right. So what is the optimized value of each of the distribution assets? And that number is what was paid. The basis for determining the winners, right, who would pay those optimized regulatory asset-based values, was a proposal as to how quickly you would reduce what is called the ATCC losses, how much you would invest into reducing the aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses, ATCC, right, of each of these discos. So that was done. Now, who were the entities that we qualified? Right. If you remember, we had started this process not in 2011 or 2012, but in 2003. In fact, in 2002, I was then in the BPE, and I went all over the world with the then chairman of the NCP, former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, and we went marketing, right, Nigeria as an opportunity. And we got a huge enthusiastic response. People came from all over the world. We met them in places, nice places like Houston, London, I think Frankfurt, right? And we got serious expressions of interest from the likes of Aeon, Scottish Power, RWE, Red Electrica, were interested of Spain, were interested in our transmission at the time. And they said to us, if you carry through this process you've described of reform, pass your laws and begin this process, we will definitely jump in and participate. It didn't happen because we did not muster the political will to get the law passed in 2003, to get the law assented to in 2003, even though it was passed by the National Assembly. So we lost that opportunity. They fell away. It came back in 2005, if you remember, passed the bill, it became law, but then we promptly went into what? NIPP. So you had a government that said it wants to reform, restructure, privatize, but at the same time it's spending billions on setting up what you might call a whole new NEPA.
Correct.
Right? That sent mixed signals to the investment world. All right? So 2007 came, government went away. Then you had a president, Yaradua, who took an express decision to stop the reform process.
Correct.
Political decision again. All right, on the advice of the so-called National Council on Energy, headed by the late Dr. Rewan Lukman, advised him not to carry through with this process because we needed to fatten the cow a little bit more before it was privatized. The old argument between do we go now or do we wait and fatten the cow a little bit more so that we get more value? So the decision was taken, right? Stop the process. President Yaradua left the scene, all right? And then President Goodluck took over and restarted. That's when you and I, Patrick, joined the PTFP.
Correct.
Okay. And remember that I was in charge of regulatory and transactions, and my job was to get the process started again, which is why my office was not even with Prof. It was in the BPE.
Correct.
All right, if you remember. So we tried to get that process started, but after a, guess what, 9-year hiatus, what happened to the investment public? They were jaded.
Correct.
This was the 3rd attempt. In fact, if you want to say the 4th, because at some point we wanted to bring in Power Grid India into the frame to work on our transmission. So by then, the investment world was a bit leery of Nigeria and saying, well, let's let you guys go. All right. So what did that mean? And don't forget, we also had this huge deluge of Nigerians demarketing Nigeria for better, for worse. That was the reality. Goodluck and his government were under fire from their political opponents who were constantly saying these things about Nigeria, which the outside world was looking at and saying, okay, political risk maybe looks to be a little charged. The atmosphere is charged at the moment, so let's wait and see. All right. Subsidies were going into the sector. And you had Dr. Mrs. Okonjo-Iweala, Minister of Finance, warning about this pot of money that we use to kind of subsidize the sector is running out. You guys need to really begin to get your act together to make this process happen. So 2011, there's an election coming up in 2015. We know very well that political economic decisions taken after, pluck a date from the air, 2013, right? No longer become that easy to take.
Correct.
Right? So we had like a 2-year time frame to make up our minds. Do we wait until 2016 because you won't do anything in 2015? Or do we go now? I don't think anybody had a crystal ball good enough to determine whether President Goodluck was going to come back in 2015. So he took a decision. Let's go. At that point in time, Patrick, who were the people in Nigeria that had money?
Because at this point, all the internationals
were not interested.
Were not interested because of the policy inconsistency.
And the flip-flop, the timing issues,
the
political environment was charged and all that. So they were not particularly interested.
Yeah.
We then had to look inwards, which is why I asked the question, who had money back then? It was oil traders.
Correct.
It was oil traders, right? We had a few corporates take interest in this, Transcorp, right? These are, by any standards, pretty good Nigerian corporate. We had Mainstream, all right? We had Sahara. Who else was there? I can't think of any other.
The guys in Benin?
VGO. I wouldn't count VGO as that. They were in business, but not in the sector. Not in
but a big conglomerate though, that had run successful companies.
Okay, all right. So VGO.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was 4 entities that you could say had some kind of cachet about them. NERC for the distribution companies did what we call the fit and proper test. And the reality is that hardly any of those bidders who had pre-qualified passed.
Correct.
Right? They all had basically managerial issues with management, issues with ability to raise finance. And for some reason, maybe because there was a general thinking around the sector that it was like the GSM business. You had a license to print money. There was this perception that this was something that was going to be spewing out cash from day one. And even though we tried to let people know that this is an investment play before you begin to get a return, they just didn't see that. But you then had decisions that needed to be taken. This is the universe of interest.
Correct.
This is the extent, the depth of capacity that we see. They all say they have technical partners, but at the end of the day, none of these technical partners had skin in the game, right? So we're looking at the Nigerians and the Nigerian entities. We were very clear in NERC about our recommendations, and it was part of the considerations that the NCP and the president had about, do we stop this or do we go forward? And they decided to go forward. For better, for worse, it was their decision, right, to go forward. And we went about it the best way we could. And I think that we got the best that we could have got at the time. For me, it was clear to me that we would have to do subsequent waves of privatization again. Okay, but before you could do that, before you could bring in better quality management, better quality financing, you had to do a cleanup, which was why you had the NEMS facility that NERC got from the CBN in 2014 that kicked in early first quarter 2015. All right. And we tried to put that together. And I think we did so successfully. And we got that 204 or so billion from the CBN that could have cleaned up the balance sheet of the industry and made it at least good enough to begin to take on new capital. That didn't work out for a decision that we all know. NEC itself decided that we're going to reduce tariffs at that time, which I think was a wrongly timed decision. And it led to a loss of credibility and confidence in the
So
sector.
let me ask a question to then dovetail into where you're going. And there's a reason why I started here, right? Because what we're going to talk about today is really about the new law and, you know, what it portends for generation and supply, right?
Yes.
But I know in the minds of many of the people who are listening, they're like, well, if privatization didn't work, if this is also predicated on private sector support, why should we get our hopes up that this would work? So let's park that conversation to set the context, right? So we know how we went through with the privatization. Why is the market insolvent today? Why is it that the market, with all the structures, all the designs, everything that's been done over the last 15 or so years, why is it that the market still does not work?
My view, again, let's set the context right. You could say that reform has been going on since 2001, 22 years. But the reality is that reform is a process that must happen with consistency over time. We've had too many starts and stops. And I would say that the longest period for which we have had a steady run, or the opportunity for a steady run, is since 2013.
2010, maybe?
Right? No, I would say 2013, because that was when you finally had new investors come in.
Okay.
Right? November 1st, 2013. So it's almost 10 years now. That's one. The why is that I would say is answered two key reasons from my standpoint. Governance, and governance here refers to the quality of decision making in both the private and the public sector spheres.
Okay.
Right? And leading into governance is the issue of liquidity in the sector.
Okay.
All right. And I don't want to reduce liquidity to tariffs. I don't want to do that because it kind of addresses only a symptom. But the reality is that when you have, if I may say it bluntly, poor quality governance, you end up with poor quality decision making at management level, which of course means that capital runs away. Okay. And all the capital that we've had into this sector, huge paradox, has largely come from the public sector, because the private sector is still waiting to see common sense decision making that is investment friendly. And so until they see that, you probably will have people depending on the revenues from within the sector itself to put back into capital investment. That's my take on it, really. Governance and liquidity issues, and you can dimension governance in any number of ways: the quality of policy making, the quality of regulation, the quality of the managers themselves in the private sector. And don't forget that the private sector, and particularly at the distribution level, generation is fine. I think we've had pretty good generation entities, investors, quality investors in generation. You could see that despite everything, Geregu Power and Perion has gone public, right? And somehow has managed to declare a dividend.
Correct.
You know, within a year of going public from this same sector. So there's something that has gone right. All right. And let's not say it's all gloom and doom. No. The issue is with the distribution side, and I think also with the transmission side. So let me also deal with transmission. The mantra that we've heard, and I've heard this for 22 years, that transmission is a national security issue, so we must preserve the national grid in government hands. I beg to disagree with all due respect.
Correct.
It is actually a security risk that we have one grid in Nigeria. All right. And we amplify that security issue with the insistence that we continue to have one grid. And all you need to do is to look at any of our system collapses. One turbine, just one turbine, goes down. Our system is manually controlled till this moment. Somewhere in Oshobo at the National Control Center sits in a room a group of gentlemen, each of which have in their hands or has in his hands 3 or 4 mobile phones, speaking to all the generation stations, asking them to drop or pick up load. You don't
it'll be comical if it wasn't true.
It's true. I've been there. I've spent a day with these guys in my time. All right. And I asked them, this is on a lighter note, I asked them, guys, how many of you do not suffer from hypertension? Nobody raised his hands.
Yes.
All right. How many of you take your drugs regularly? All of them raised their hands.
Yes.
So that's how we manually control our grid. And so that grid is not going to grow no matter how much money we put into it until we look at that. But that is the security issue. One turbine goes down, the entire country is in darkness. The entire country. And so our industry does not depend on the grid. That is the reality. If you have industry that is spending, I don't know, 15, 20, 25% of its profits, maybe even more, on self-generation, you will have very slow, if at all, reinvestment into the sector in which that industry.
Some of the numbers I've seen is about 30% cost of goods.
So we are actually shooting ourselves in the foot. And really, the issue again is, Patrick, 99% politics. You've got people here in this town, Abuja, who want to keep control of TCN, and they're all government entities. All right, TCN can work perfectly in private hands. All you have to do is look at our telecoms, right? Our national transmission grid, if I may use that word for telecoms, is in the hands of the private sector. It's WATS, MTN, it's Glo's fiber network, it's Main One, right? They give us access to the wider world. It has
the counter argument, Eyo, is that we've also tried private sector management. Remember, it was
we never did, Patrick. We didn't. No, let's be honest with it. The moment we brought in the Canadians, we also tied their hands with a big millstone. All right, we said to them, "You have no business going to market operations and touching the money there." Right, making sure that the money goes to who it is meant to go to. We know what happened. All right, so let's not go there. The bottom line is that for as long as we want to continue with transmission being the way it is, if we don't begin to think around a number of interconnected regional grids, which is the way TCN is actually set up, when we have a system collapse, we come back through those regional islands, all right, one after the other. So it's not that nobody knows that this can happen. It's just that we haven't mustered the will to cut through the BS and say this should stop. All right. So that's one side. Distribution. Again, on the distribution side, that's where you have all the challenges and where you have those entities that I think need to go through a second wave of privatization. How that is going to be worked out, not for me to discuss here.
What are some of these entities?
There 6 of them have been taken over. And I mean, the entire sector is under this unique financial management put into place by the CBN, which is unusual. It's not. So really, in some ways, an entity which is not a telecom, an electricity regulator, but which has a key say in how the industry evolves, is the CBN, because it has put together this management framework for the entire cash flows of the industry.
Because the CBN put its own money in.
Yeah.
So you have to.
Obviously. Yeah. CBN is the largest single creditor outside the DFIs.
The point is that the discos are not doing well. So in reality, what we should be talking about is for those discos to be reprivatized or to bring in new owners, or to allow some of us to buy into those, raise new capital, and then they can do things in a different way.
If you have the money to put into a disco, good luck to you. But at the moment, those of us who have small money that really we cannot afford to lose or throw away would like to see quality management and some results first.
All right.
Right. So again, at this point in time, back to where we were in 2011, 2012, the only entities that I think would be keen to look at the electricity sector today are all here in Nigeria. You're not going to have anybody outside who doesn't know Nigeria, all right? No matter how deep their pool of investable funds are, or maybe, they are not going to take a punt on Nigeria, not yet, until we have cleaned up, got our act together. So I really think that there's an opportunity, also a big challenge there, right? We've got to find ways to reprivatize or to carry through a second and third wave of privatization, if you will, in the distribution sector. And we'll see how that goes.
So with this context that we've established now, the federal government of Nigeria, working with the National Assembly, then does an amendment, to the 1999 Constitution, which now empowers the states to make laws for generation, transmission, distribution of electricity within their territories, right?
Yes.
This amendment, many have argued, could be a significant game changer in Nigeria's quest to achieve universal electricity access and reliability, if the states know how to navigate to such an outcome, right?
Yes.
Can you give us a bit of a historical on how we got to this amendment, what this amendment means for the states, and then how the states can leverage this amendment to drive increased supply to the inhabitants of the state?
Yes. Okay, so Patrick, first, many have called it a new law. It's not a new law. There's no law at federal level yet. It is an amendment to the Constitution.
Okay.
So the 1999 Constitution says in the concurrent list, again, there's another misconception that power has been an exclusive legislative item. It is not. It has never been, in fact.
By exclusive, you mean it's only the federal government that...
Yes.
Okay.
There are three types of legislative matters. Exclusive matters, those on the exclusive list, which the federal government alone, through the National Assembly, has the power to make laws. And there are, I think, 64 or so items on that list. Only the federal government has the power to make laws in those areas. Then you have the concurrent list. The concurrent list are those matters in which there's a shared responsibility in some way that is defined by the wording of that list. So under the 1963 Constitution, electricity was regional, right? Our first Republican Constitution, it was regional. So the regions could set up their own frameworks for setting up electricity, and delivering electricity services to their citizens.
Yeah.
In the 1979 Constitution, it became a concurrent matter clearly defined. And the 1979 Constitution said, and let me read to you. There were two items in the concurrent list, paragraphs 13 and 14 in the 79 Constitution. They said, first, the National Assembly may make laws for the federation or any part thereof with respect to A, electricity and the establishment of electric power stations, B, the generation and transmission of electricity to any part of the federation from one state to another. What the Americans like to call interstate commerce.
Okay.
All right. So those are the two key provisions that empower the federal government. Patrick, what's the first thing you notice about what I've just read? The word distribution is nowhere stated to be a National Assembly responsibility.
Correct.
And the first thing we were taught in that aspect of law that deals with interpretation of documents and statutes is that you do not read into a document what is not there. So it was clear in 1979 that distribution was not a National Assembly responsibility. That takes me to paragraph 14 of the concurrent list, which read, a House of Assembly may make laws for the state with respect to electricity and the establishment in that state of electric power stations. This is 14A of the concurrent list.
Of so the 1979 Constitution.
Yes, it mirrors the 13A, only to the extent that the National Assembly, the House of Assembly, like that of National Assembly, may make laws for electricity and the establishment of power stations. For the federal, it is in any part of the country. For the state, it is only within that state. B, the generation, that a House of Assembly may make laws for the state with respect to B, the generation, transmission, and distribution to within that state. Simple.
So what you're saying is that, as you know, back in the 79 Constitution, the states were already empowered to do both generation, transmission, and distribution.
Everything. Not to do, but to make laws for
make
the
laws.
people.
Yeah.
Very different. Very. Let's always have that in mind.
Yeah.
To make laws to enable the doing of those things by anyone.
So how did we then misunderstand that section and leave the responsibilities in the hands of
history? Again, context. In 1979, we had just emerged from 13 years of military rule, which was preceded effectively by 3 years or 6 years of Republican rule, half of which was under a governor general who before he became president in 1963. All right. 9 years before 1960, ECN was established, the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria, and it was established in a unitary fashion. So ECN took responsibility across the entire country for electrifying the country, building power plants, and delivering electricity to Nigerians. Even though we had regions that, in many respects, were autonomous regions after 1960 and definitely after 1963, electricity was still carried on in centrally managed, centrally determined fashion. So you had ECN that had these thermal stations in Lagos. There was even one in Calabar, close to my homestead in Calabar, Oji River, right? I think in Afam, they started building in Afam, I think 1962, it was commissioned in 1966, all right? It was the Niger Dams Authority that was established in 1963 or 1962 to carry through the Kainji project, which started construction in 1964. All right. So all this was being done by the federal government. All right. When the military came, naturally, they took all that over and continued with central management. That's the way the military runs, command and control. All right. In 1972, you had Niger Dams Authority and ECN merged to form what? NEPA. Again, central control. NEPA had 3 sectors: generation sector, transmission sector, distribution and marketing sector, headed by executive directors or then principal managers first before it became EDs, all right, who headed those sectors, which were themselves siloed within NEPA under a managing director. Okay. 1979, therefore, was 7 years away from setting up NEPA. And we had states run by politicians who had come of age under central management and control. 4 years later, the military came back. You never really had the opportunity for the 1979 class to actually think through, this is what we have. So it never happened. So the way my view is that historically, we were always conditioned to central management and control. It was in 1999 that you then had what I regard as a mischievous act that was done. You know, the 99 Constitution is by and large the 79 Constitution rewritten in certain aspects. So let's look at what the 99 Constitution then said about electricity. Again, Section 13, the same thing as 79, no difference. The National Assembly may make laws for the Federation or any part thereof with respect to electricity and the establishment of electric power stations. B, National Assembly may make laws for the Federation or any part thereof with respect to B, the generation and transmission of electricity in or to any part of the Federation and from one state to another. So again, hold that in mind. 14 then says, this is 99 now, a House of Assembly may make laws for the state with respect to A, electricity and the establishment in that state of electric power stations. B, please listen to this very carefully, the generation, transmission, And distribution, in that respect, the same as 79, right? Up to this point, the same as 79. So the generation, transmission, and distribution of electricity, listen to this, to areas not covered by a national grid system within that state. So it now became, if a state wishes to make laws for generation, transmission, distribution, you can only do so in an area that is not covered by a national grid system in that state. Yeah. So the question now became, Patrick, one of both of fact, but to the extent that you had a federal government that was already saying, I am there.
Yes.
Right? You would then have to have an argument within a legal setting or judicial setting as to which part of my state is an area that is not covered by a national grid system, such that I can make laws for people to go and set up generation, transmission, distribution in those parts.
Okay.
It sounds easy to work it out, but the question would then be, Patrick, am I covered by a national grid system just because I have the national grid and its towers and lines passing through my state, even if I am 100 kilometers away from that grid and there's no distribution assets that feed off that grid to serve me? Let me give you a practical example of how this played out. All right? You remember, Patrick, AFAM, when we're in PTFP, AFAM Village had its first turbine commissioned in September 1966 and tied to the national grid in September 1966. AFAM 1. All right. It has one of the biggest gas processing facilities. It has one of Nigeria's largest and most complex transmission substations. All right. You have there AFAM 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Patrick, it wasn't until 2011 or 2010, sorry,
they got electricity,
when Professor Naji was told that AFAM has no light. And he said, okay, so that's a NEPA problem, right? That's a Port Harcourt Disco problem. And he said, no, they are not on the national grid.
Not connected.
The people of AFAM in that village look every day, and they did so for 55 years, right? Or sorry, 45 years, from 1966 to 55 years to 2010, 54 years. They looked at power, gas, energy, going to Nigeria. Are they covered by a national grid system?
Of course they are.
Yeah.
So the state cannot even step in,
Patrick,
and do anything.
So you had no state interested in interrogating that question, except Lagos, which decided to do Enron, right? I think they could have done it differently, but that's neither here nor there. They did something. Rivers set up first independent power, all right? Akwa Ibom set up Ibom Power, okay? You had those three states, but they never really could go beyond that. And we all know the story of all those. Someone told them, whatever it is you build it for the national grid. So we'll tie it to the national grid. You can't do it to serve the people of your state, which was a lie. But you know, they say sometimes if you want to hide things from us, put it into a book, right? So we wrote the national policy in 2001. And the policy was very clear that states had a very important role to play in the power sector in delivering power off grid. We didn't say to areas not covered. That was a factious. We just simply said off grid. All right, in the National Electric Power Policy. States didn't buy it into that. The act came in 2005, and you then had expressly the federal government taking responsibility for regulating distribution in the act. Okay? That was essentially because no one was interested in going beyond NEPA. We had the NEPA model to build on. And when you look at the way the sector itself has evolved, we've really basically evolved along the lines of NEPA. So generation, we took the 6 or 7 power plants that reported to the ED generation and corporatized them. We took TCN and corporatized it, built a corporate entity around the assets of TCN and around each of the generating plants. We took the 9 zones, the 9 distribution and marketing zones of NEPA, PHCN, right, and made them into corporate entities, with the exception of Lagos, which became 2 entities. Yeah. It was too big to be left as 1 entity. That was the perception then. And also with the exception of Aba Disco. Most people don't know that Aba Disco was also incorporated to take account of the arrangement to lease the assets of Aba and Osisioma districts, right, to Geometric at that time, to carry to what was effectively a concession. It was a trial run to see how that would unfold. All right, and that was done. So you had essentially the evolution taking place along the lines of NEPA. All right, and so we're all content with that. We all expected that things would happen. In the footprint of each of the discos would expand. We would see more IPPs come in. The legacy Gencos would be augmented by new IPPs, and even they themselves perhaps could also spawn off. They would spawn or give birth to new entities that would be subsidiaries of their own. That has happened to some extent. You've got NIPP, you've got the likes of Mainstream now talking about doing other plants, both within and outside the country. You've got Sahara Power, and you've got Transcorp, Ugeli, you've got Sahara Power. They're all there, and at least they're doing reasonably okay on the generation side. On the distribution side, we've stayed static at those 11 distribution companies. And so that's how that has gone.
So my question then is, given again this context that you've set, what will this amendment do? Because what the amendment basically did was to take us back to 79, correct?
Yes. The amendment removed that phrase, areas...
A mischievous phrase.
Yes. Areas not covered by a national grid system, and said, again, like you said in 1979, the states may make laws with respect to generation, transmission, and distribution within that state. This is precisely what you have in large federal jurisdictions: Brazil, Chile, Russia, China, India, the United States of America, where practically all our regulators and our policymakers have visited under the auspices of NERUC. So a framework in which you have a federal electricity or federally regulated wholesale market, and you have state entities under their public utility regulatory commissions regulated to carry on business within those states. It's not strange to us. It isn't strange. What is perhaps strange is the idea that states now have the exclusive right
to make
laws to carry on electricity business entirely within those states. All right? It sounds strange to us, because what they are saying is that essentially states can now make laws to regulate the footprint of discos within those states. States can now make laws to regulate what NERC calls, for example, IEDNs, independent electricity, and IETNs, independent electricity transmission and distribution networks, right? As long as those entities, IEDNs, IETNs, carry on business, moving electricity, distributing electricity to customers wholly within that state. Conceptually, according to this amendment, it is now the responsibility of the states to make laws for that activity.
So let me ask 2 questions and just help us unpack this.
Yes.
Now, does the new law empower the states to make laws?
The constitutional amendment, you mean?
The constitutional amendment, does it empower the states to then make laws that the existing discos have to operate under, or is it to make laws to create new entities that can become generating plants, transmission, and also distribution within their states?
Both.
Or both?
Both.
So that means
So
that
to the
like
extent
a Benin disco, an Enugu disco, just disco, all the regulation. So how does this play? How do the states interface with NERC, with the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission?
I think there has to be. So I get a sense of deja vu, right? Thinking about this, because in 2001, when I joined BPE and I was thrown headfirst into power sector reform, the first thing that the guys in NEPA, Engineer Makoju, may the Almighty rest his soul, right, said to me, so Ayo, are you saying that Ministry of Power has to give up its responsibility for the sector? I said, well, that's what it means. And he said, what about NEPA? I said, there are going to be many NEPAs, right? And NEPA will have to decentralize. It was quiet, right? But the idea was seeded very clearly. Regulatory responsibility is no longer ministries. It's now going to be in a regulatory entity.
Mm-hmm.
That regulatory entity will take responsibility for not NEPA, but for the various, what the act calls successor companies that will emerge from NEPA. So the idea of a disassembly, of decentralization is not strange, right? It is what has created the status quo that we have now. Now, what this constitutional amendment therefore then does is to clarify a power that the states have always had. It's not new. They've always had it. And therefore, there is a need, just like we did 22 years ago, we all need to sit around the table and work out how this evolutionary process will go. Now, the good thing is this. You're not going to have 36 states getting up tomorrow and saying, this is my power, I want to exercise it. No, it's not going to happen. And it shouldn't happen, right? They're going to have a few states. Now, who are those states, or which are those states? Ondo State has passed an electricity law, right? Lagos State has an electricity law in its House of Assembly. In fact, Ondo State has set up a regulatory bureau, an electricity regulatory bureau, the first of its kind in this country, is already existing in Ondo State. Kaduna State has just 10 days or so ago sent its its Utilities Regulatory Commission law and its electricity law to its House of Assembly, 2 laws, right? Kaduna State already has had a Water and Sanitation Regulatory Commission. That is now going to become a Utilities Regulatory Commission with various units, one dealing with environmental, one dealing with electricity, one dealing with water and sanitation, just like you have in the States, right? The Public Utilities Regulatory Commission. They're going to have one, right? So laws are now being crafted by states to enable the execution of that responsibility to provide a framework for delivering electricity access to their citizens. And let's not forget, distribution is not really a federal response. Even if the act, the Constitution did not say so, right? Distribution by definition is local. Local activity is the responsibility of who? The states. So my urging, my position here is that we need to begin to think of a further decentralization of the distribution sector. It was never the intention, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, right? But I have a bit of institutional memory here. It was never the intention that we would remain at 11 discos. There would be more.
So let me make an argument.
And there would also be a look at the idea of the design, another look as things begin to unfold and evolve at the design of the sector. All right. Here we have one national sector that goes from generation through transmission to these 11 discos or 12 discos, right? And it's centrally regulated, right? At some point in time, you would begin to have, if you have states building or creating laws that enable the building of private generation plants. Some states are now thinking of enabling the building of transmission lines. Rivers State already has one.
So before we go there, Ayo, answer one quick question for me, and then we can get into this conversation. So so the guys who bought the discos, right? The distribution companies.
Yes.
At privatization, they paid some money.
Yes, they did. Oh, yeah. Okay,
and they paid some money for a territory.
Yes.
Right? So if you take Enugu Disco, for instance, they paid to have the right to distribute power to 5 states. At the point when they did this, they were, a monopoly, so to speak, for that region. You come back 10 years later and you say to them, what you paid for, we're now going to open it up to any number of distribution companies we so want to.
Not just we as federal government, but states also.
No, the states. I'm not talking about the states. Now can open it up to any number of distribution companies.
Yes.
Where is the fairness in that? And what is the counter argument you make with such owners of a distribution company to show them that they are not effectively losing out?
The first thing you do is let's agree what the facts are. Section 7110 of the EPSRA, which became law in 2005, says no license shall be granted on the basis that it confers an exclusive right to any territory. 7110 law. The same law that they all looked at. If they didn't see that, you need to go and take a look at it again, and they will see it there. That section was interpreted by the Federal High Court in a case that was decided, I think, in 2021 between the entities that were given a right by the REA to go do a small network in area market, right? Enugu Disco said, you can't do that, we have a monopoly, it's our territory, you can't come here. He went to court. The court interpreted 7110 very clearly and said, no entity, generation, transmission, distribution has an exclusive right to any part of Nigerian territory. And more importantly, your contract, you have 2 as a disco. You've got your license given to you by NERC. You have the contracts under which you came into the sector, signed with BPE. Your license is very clear. There's nothing exclusive in there, so let's not go to that one. Your contract with BPE was never about territory. It was about assets. Remember, right? I said to you, what was valued was the regulatory asset base that was handed over to the coin investors in exchange for their money, those assets. The assets were in specific territories. So to understand your rights over or in, more likely, I won't say over because it begins to confer that idea of some form of sovereignty. To understand your rights in that territory, look at your license. Your license says you will operate a distribution network within that territory with these assets.
And it does not say that you have exclusive rights.
There's any form of exclusivity at all.
Okay, so that is understood. So you're now sitting with the governor of pick any state, Kaduna, right? Edo, Lagos, wherever. And they know that this amendment has happened. They know what their rights are now. What are the combination of things the state needs to enable that can then get that state to 24/7 power? Can you lay out for us the building blocks of different things? So what I'm hoping to achieve with this segment of questioning is, if I get in front of the governor, I'm going to say to him, here is this tape, go to minute number, whatever, I don't know where we are, 55, and listen to what you need to do under this amendment to provide 24/7 power in your state. So go ahead.
All right. Again, Governor, what is your objective? He will tell
power
me
to drive my industries, power to
no.
quality of life.
Keep it simple. He will tell me, I want universal access, reliable universal access within my state across all demographics, residential, commercial, industrial.
Affordable.
You say 24/7. I think in Nigeria today, if we got 27, we'd be happy with that.
Okay.
Right? So I won't even say 24/7. I'll say, look, Governor, 27, look at these target. That's your target.
Mm-hmm.
All right. To do that, bottom line for all of us, it's about investment.
Okay.
Okay. No state, and let's be clear about this, not even Lagos, has the capacity to make the needed investments across fuel supply, generation, transmission. I think for Lagos, since we're using Lagos, even system operation and certainly not distribution.
Mm-hmm.
It has the enablers, the key enablers. It has the ability to set a framework.
Okay.
It has the ability to make laws. It has the ability to identify policy objectives, right? It has the ability to speak to investors and describe its state, the nature of its state, the nature of the putative market, right? And the things that that state can deliver to help an investor bed down to deliver that electricity or that energy to its citizens.
Okay.
So it is not a blank slate. On this piece of paper, we've been writing things for the last 20, how many? 2005, 16, no, 18 years, right? Since 2005. So it's not a blank slate. You've got a Ministry of Power, you've got a NERC, you've got discos in place. So let's say, I don't use Lagos, let's use my state, Cross River, okay. Right? It's covered by PHED, all right? PHED has
electricity distribution.
Yeah, Port Harcourt electricity distribution. It's got a footprint across 4 states, all right? There, in my state, there are 2 power plants. There's the Unicem power plant, 3. There's the Unicem power plant. There's the, which is I think 100 megas or something like that. There's the NIPP, Odupani, right? Which I think is 450 or 540. I can't remember. It's either 450 or 540. And then there's the 26 megawatt plant that my own state government did some time ago, diesel fired. I don't know whether it's working, but it's there. All right. So you have that. You also have a distribution network and you have transmission lines within the state. 7 mostly the southern part, not even the northern part. The northern part is served by distribution that comes in from Enugu Disco. Okay. I want investors to come into my state to build local networks.
Local distribution networks.
Local distribution networks. Okay. I could conceptually sit down with Port Harcourt Disco about corporatizing the distribution assets within Cross River State so that the laws I make as a state government, as a House of Assembly, can then apply to a corporate entity that has assets within my state. I cannot make laws that apply to Port Harcourt Disco as a whole, all right? Because Port Harcourt Disco also covers Akwa Ibom, Bayelsa, and Rivers State. I need to address only the assets. In the same way in which NEPA, by statutory mandate, evolved from NEPA to PHCN to Port Harcourt Disco,
correct,
under the guidance of the NCP and the BPE. In that same way, can PHED also then evolve into a, what can name from the air, Cross River State Electricity Distribution, right? So that the assets within Cross River are there, okay? Then we sit down, and this is me trying to be practical, we sit down and work out the licensing framework. I would expect that the license of PHED would be grandfathered, right, to a Calabar electricity distribution, so that the same requirements, the same provisions in the NEC license are now ascribed to a state regulator whenever it has to be established. So I, right, as a state, have to do a number of things first. I've got to create a framework by law. I can't just walk into NEC or the Ministry of Power and say, give me. I'll be taken seriously, right? I need to have some form of a credible policy and legal framework put in place, which means go home and do your homework, right? Create that framework, put it in place, law, policy, right? Have the law passed. The Constitution says law made by the House of Assembly. Let the House of Assembly do their work, right? Yeah. Pass the law, all right? Then you have a platform for engaging with a NERC about how do we transit the responsibility. Let's not forget, NERC wasn't born in 1960. It was born in 2006, right? The powers that were exercised by the Minister of Power through what was then called the Electricity Inspectorate Services of the Ministry of Power were handed over to NERC. And it didn't take 3 years, 2 years, 4 years. It was instant.
Yes.
Right? As soon as NERC was established, I think NERC was established in Benway House or somewhere like that in central area, right? The first staff of NERC came from BPE. They were my guys, right? They went to NERC. And the power passed. Commissioners were appointed, and the first thing they did was to create a licensing framework. They didn't do it in 4 years, in 3 years. They did it in months, right? And guess what? They issued licenses to who? The NEPA successor companies. Again, it didn't take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They did it in months. And those companies, like it or not, had to take those licenses and fall under NERC regulation, right? Now, it was a fractious process, right? But we went through it. And the authority of NERC was established by a government that said to ministry, that's your territory, stay there. This is regulatory territory, NERC stays there. You don't cross over into it. So there has to be a conversation around a transition. I've heard people talk about years. I don't think it should take years, all right? Yes, capacity is lacking at state level. Yeah. It's not there, but none of the people that went into NERC from BPE was a regulator when they got there. But they were put through an immersive process. They went all over the world, right? Spent time in various regulatory entities and came back, right? With an understanding, at least conceptually, of what it takes to regulate. You also had commissioners, particularly someone like Ransom Owen, who was the first chairman of NERC, who came from the States as somebody who had already had regulatory sector experience in energy, right? So he brought some of that to Nigeria. So there has to be a certain degree of cross-pollination, but there has to be first a conversation around what do we transit, who do we engage with first, the person speaking here now is the federal government, NERC, ministry, who do we engage with? So states must do that little bit of work of creating an entity that can be addressed, embodied or clothed with powers to regulate. Then you sit down with NERC. I think rather than have this wild west type situation of states just coming in and doing as they please, there has to be mutual respect and engagement, because the reality is that this power, first and foremost, to regulate all electricity activity that is exclusively carried on within the state, belongs to the state. We have to pay respect to that first. Once we recognize that, then we can begin to have a conversation over how do we transit and when do we transit this responsibility to you guys at state level.
So we assume we get all of that done. How do we then set up an electricity market that enables private investors to come in and build out the generation, build out the transmission, build out, the distribution, without necessarily relying on government to provide the money? I mean, government has to do some of the preliminary work, to set up this market. What does that work that government needs to do? What does it entail? And then what must this electricity market have to make it attractive for private sector folks who know that some of the investors in the current privatization may be struggling a little bit, but what do we need to say to them that would incentivize them to then move in and play in this new electricity market to deliver affordable, reliable, universal access, etc., to the people in the States?
Honestly, I can't be prescriptive. I can tell you that
you can draw boxes. You can draw the outlines.
Okay, I'll try. I can tell you that it's going to be messy, right? Because that's the nature of reform and evolution from the known into a known unknown. And the known unknown here is a state that has set up a framework of laws. So first and foremost, you must have states taking time to look at their socioeconomic conditions and creating laws, policy backed by laws that describes what that situation is and how they would like it to be addressed. This is no longer academic. I said to you earlier on, Ondo State has a law. Edo State has a law. The House of Assembly has passed that law. Kaduna State will probably have theirs passed before the 29th of May. Lagos State, probably the same thing. So you already have 4 states, all right, that to varying degrees, not to varying degrees, have set up laws that in varying ways describe what each state wants to achieve and do. The private sector needs to engage with that. Now, they will then, of course, be cautious because it is not a blank slate. You have a federal government that is there. I expect that the federal government would be willing to encourage a conversation, 3-way conversation between investors, states, and federal about how each market in each state, if each state then comes forward, all right? And it's not states supplicating in Abuja. It's states saying, we are aware of our power. We have passed our laws. This is our entity. You need to engage with us, all right? I think that it is important to engage in a respectful manner between federal and state governments with that, mutual respect. It's not about fear, it's not about intimidation, it's not about bullying, it's not about a state taking, right? Grabbing authority. No, what will you do with it? You will only create, uncertainty and confusion, and you don't want the investors to feel that there's too much of smoke in here. You want them to be as comfortable as possible. So I think there needs to be mutual working together. I can't emphasize this enough, all right? But states have to do that work of making an approach with some framework that is credible, all right? And that means for it to be credible, you must have got a policy framework, you must have clear-cut objectives, you must have, at least on paper, a design for your market. Your generating entities, how do you want them to look like? Your transmission entities, will you have any? Your distribution, will you have any? Is your state complex enough to look to having a system operator going forward? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. But these are boxes that could exist within a state. What is then left is to then take responsibility across to that state. Now, if, assuming that that transition happens, states then begin to issue regulatory precepts, regulatory authorizations to entities to get into, particularly first generation, right? Yes. But I expect that there has to be clarity about distribution because that's where the money is going to come from. So these discos that are at state level, will they then be set up in such a way that they can be regulated by states? There are various incidents to that, not least of which is the fact that almost all the discos owe some federal entity or the other. If it's not MBET, it's the CBN, right? So some discussion has to go into how do we ascribe to this state entity that has been born out of an existing disco, right? How do we ascribe a part of this debt to that entity to repay? That's a commercial issue. It can be resolved, right? And we're not going to do that here in this discussion. Sure. But once you've done all that, you then have addressable entities at state level that you can then empower. Now, I believe very strongly that as of today, maybe not for all time, but as of today, the sum of each of the parts, every one of the 36 parts of this national whole, individually, is actually prospectively has more potential than the market we have today. You can see the market that we have today. It's 4,000 megawatts, all right? It's technically insolvent, okay? You've got 6 of the discos already in technical administration under the auspices of one bank or the federal government or the other, all right? So this framework that we have was born out of NEPA. I call it the NEPA model. So the NEPA model has not worked for us. We've tried to take it as far as it can go for various reasons, which I think I've tried to mention earlier on, governance issues, liquidity issues. We've not gone as far as we want to. So we need to look at some other way. We need to rethink our market design. And if that rethinking of our market design involves the states creating frameworks for engagement by the private sector, then so be it. You know, it's the only way we can go forward. So I think that there are incidents. I've mentioned a few, right?
Sure.
Technical issues. Where do you create your boundaries between states and the rest of the disco? What happens with TCN? I think that's the easiest. TCN continues to deliver energy into each of these states like it has been doing before. But is there an opportunity there for TCN also? I think there is. All right. As states begin to aggregate capacity, there's also scope for TCN to become an entity that has various regional power pools or grids that serve those states that have their own regional or state-based distribution entities. Sure. And can deliver more power into them because you have more generation located within that region that is focused not on the national grid, but on those states within its captive region. So, you know, how it will unfold is a matter of time, but the first steps have to be collaborative, have to be mutually supportive between the federal and state government entities.
Let me go to some of the questions from the participants. There's a question here. If a disco footprint covers multiple states with some of its feeders and infrastructure crossing state borders, therefore into the exclusive territory, does all of the disco get covered by the federal laws, or does a disco get to operate under different laws done by the... I think you've kind of answered this question, you know. That...
Let me clarify something. All the discos today have technical boundaries, right? Even in Lagos, you've got technical boundaries between Eko and Ikeja within Lagos. All right. Let's not think of boundaries as the lines we have on our maps.
Geographic, yeah.
Right. We're not talking about administrative boundaries here. We're talking about technical engineering boundaries. Every single disco has two sets of boundaries. One with the national grid, where it receives energy into its territory. All right. And these boundaries are in most cases, in multiple parts. All right. So Lagos State, for instance, receives energy from the national grid at I think Ajah and I think Alagmo, right? I can't quite, I'm not sure now, but you have states like that, all right? So that's one boundary with the federal. Then within each footprint of each disco, you've got other boundaries, right? 132.33, 33.11, all right? kV voltage. So it's not, from a technical standpoint, it's not difficult at all, one must say, right? No matter how people try to dress it up, but it's actually not that difficult to create a boundary. And you know what? If you don't have a boundary, and I give an example, right? Kaduna State, the northern part of Kaduna State, the Brain side of Kaduna State receives energy from Niger State through Tegina, right? You can actually put a feeder within the Kaduna State territory, and that's where you have your boundary, right? So boundaries, unlike the administrative ones that we see on our maps, from an engineering standpoint, can be created, recreated, moved around. Okay, so that it's not difficult to separate states, all right, if necessary, into entities that can be addressed from a regulatory standpoint by a state regulator.
So there's a question from Jude Anyibo, and he says, what was the private electricity generation and distribution company, I guess, we had in Jos for so long? Please describe the model and how the states can apply that.
Good question, which speaks to the fact that this can be done. So in Jos, it's not was, by the way, Jude. Was it Joe? Was it Joe Anyibo?
Jude Anyibo.
Okay, let's know Joe Anyibo. So Jude, it's not was, it's still there. NESCO is still there. It operates in Jos. It is in fact the oldest distribution company in Nigeria, been in continuous business since 1926. It's been there, right? And they in Jos Township, it was set up to serve the tin mines, all right? And then it extended lines to parts of Jos, the old part of Jos. You have lines for Jos Disco, you've got lines for NESCO, all right? They serve their respective customers, and it's there. So conceptually, you could have multiple transmission lines, but ideally, you don't want that crisscrossing each other, all right? So there's a certain level of monopolization that a disco, even if it doesn't have an exclusive right, like I mentioned earlier on, it does have a de facto kind of monopoly. So states will have to look at what level then do we introduce competition, because you can't have expanded access without some form of competition. And I think that that level of competition subsists at the 11 kV 415 volt level. How that will be done, again, it's not something we can discuss here, but there's scope for competition because most of us do not realize, all right, that going back to the NEPA days, distribution was actually under a sector called distribution and marketing. It spoke to the fact that distribution, the discos today are actually two businesses in one. The wires business and the marketing side, the side that goes to look for customers, takes them on, meters them, gets them to be able to pay for services and to collect that money from them and then manage their various customer care related issues.
So, Ayo, here's a practical question for you. So let's assume there's a guy who does generation and he's got money to go into any state, pick any state, Cross River, for instance, and drop a generation plant.
Yes.
But there is no one to build out like new distribution network. So, but he wants to sell within Cross River. How do we get that kind of transaction off the ground today?
He wants to sell.
He wants to
sell energy.
Yes. So he generates, he wants to sell into a distribution company. There is no new distribution. He has to work with Port Harcourt Disco. How would that work out today? But he wants for the power to be distributed within Cross River and not to be put on the grid.
Well, Patrick, we know that power generation technology has evolved to a point where we can efficiently generate in smaller quantities.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm addressing here the concept of distributed generation. So I don't want to, and I shouldn't want to build a 150, 250 megawatt power plant that would have to go and connect with the grid at the transmission, the 330 kV transmission substation in Ikorekweneo in Calabar, right? No, I wouldn't do that. I would rather sit down with the disco, identify that there's a group of customers who need to be served, and build a 10, 15, 20 megawatt power plant that will connect directly to the disco at 33 kV level, all right? And then work with the disco to reinforce the quality of the feeders and the substations in that area, make sure that all the customers are metered, because I must have identified my universe of customers who will be served. So I need to make sure that that their money can be addressed. And then I negotiate a PPA with that disco, which hopefully will be commercial enough to enable me raise money to build my power plant. So I think it's baby steps, right? That will probably start with distributed generation. And when we begin to then expand the footprint and increase the demand, because the one thing about power, like telecoms over the last 20 years in Nigeria, is that the demand grows exponentially once some level of quality of service is assured. Demand begins to grow exponentially. So, but we have to take that first baby step of a small generator, negotiating with the disco in a small enclave, identifying the source of fuel, whether it's hydro, so it's some renewable or some thermal source,
CNG or whatever,
and then tie to that and make sure that you can address the need of that entity. Now, there are some parts of state that are perceived to be uneconomic, right? I don't believe that those places are uneconomic. They are perceived to be uneconomic, right? But they also need to be addressed. And you hardly have service in those areas. That's where I think states can engage, all right? Engage in the sense that rather than look for a state government entity that goes out like the REA to go and build things, you can actually aggregate funding, make sure that you find an entity that is licensed to operate in that area, work out capital cost of addressing the connections required in those areas, and that's where you direct your subsidy to as a state entity. Subsidize capital and not the current or consumption expenditure. Make sure that you have a private entity already licensed in that area that has a design for serving that area, has costed that, work out how much of that cost can be paid for by the community, paid for by the state, and then the state injects that share along with another bit that comes from the private sector. So you've got three contributory parties in this: the state government, maybe the community, hopefully, not necessarily the community, but hopefully the community can take on some element of cost, labor cost, buy the meters or something, right? State government can then put in a contribution to capital. The private sector player, which is already licensed for that area and sees an exorbitant capital cost, can have that capital cost then brought down by the contribution of both the community and the state. And you have your capital connection or your capex spending in that area. And therefore, if you can do that, then the cost of service also comes down, because part of that cost has been picked up. That one-time cost, which needs to be returned, has been picked up by the state. So, and the state would not want that return to come to it. It's, as it were, social spending, but in a commercial sense.
So essentially, the amendment allows any state in Nigeria to be able to do all these things that we've talked about today, and in fact, to start tomorrow morning, if they can find if they can find some interested private sector players, who are willing to come in, do new generation to serve, whether it be an industrial park or some of the underserved or unserved communities.
I imagine that, yes, that is the situation. I imagine that the nature of the evolution will pretty much follow how all commercially focused infrastructure utilities evolve, right? You start like 2001, September, I think it was, MTN came to market where it wasn't in Calabar, it wasn't in Ojoto, right? It was in Lagos, right? And we paid through our noses. I remember, I think then it was 20,000 naira or something like that for a SIM card.
Yeah,
20K for a SIM card, but we paid. And we saw the value immediately, right, of that service. Then you started building out gradually. So I think that states that take the plunge in an organized fashion, in other words, you go through a policy-making process, you market your state, you have a pool, however small, of investors, you pass a law, you sit down with NERC. This is a work of months, right? I imagine that when they do begin to license, they will license entities that would want to serve the better heeled parts of those states. But it is up to those state entities to make sure that their design, by definition, pushes more and more players out into the so-called underserved and unserved areas. That's the way I think it will evolve, and really, that's what makes sense.
No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe in closing, maybe just tell us a little bit of the interesting work you're doing recently, with Escredite. Say maybe in Kaduna and in some others.
So to the extent of that, one can, I don't have any NDAs signed with any of my clients, but by definition, it's also work that has to be done quietly. But I've been working with a number of private entities, all right, that are building captive systems, all right, in Lagos, in Oyo states, and there's one hopefully in Ogun State, all right. So they're building captive networks for things like data centers, for estates, for industrial parks, all right. So there's that. I've also had the privilege of working with Lagos State in the evolution of its policy and legal framework with other partners, ACAS law particularly in Lagos. I helped Lagos draft their policy framework. The same thing with Edo, with Kaduna, and one or two states now in the southeast are beginning to look reasonably good, and one hopes that they will eventually become, shall I say, avatars, forerunners of state markets in the southeast. I think that personally, I think that the southeast has great prospects for becoming Nigeria's first regional pool for power.
Why do you say that?
Because it's homogeneous. The southeast states are covered by a single disco, and I think that we are now at that inflection point in the country where our discos have to begin to rethink the way they are set up, they are structured, the way they operate within the design that has been set up for them. This development in the Constitution is something that I think we shouldn't allow ourselves to be forced into, but we should look at it, understand it, and embrace the opportunity. Take on the challenge, because there are challenges, take on the challenges, deal with them, engage with public sector entities at both federal and state level, and make and own the process of evolution. If you don't own it as a private sector player, somebody else will.
Question.
Yeah.
Institutions in the power sector, and this, we're going to close out with this. The bulk trader,
yeah.
Stay or go?
The bulk trader did what?
Should it stay or should it be packed up?
It has to evolve. The bulk trader was never meant to be a permanent entity. I remember that the first license for MBET, right, passed through my division, and we were very clear in our minds that after 3 years, and that's it, I think that provision was put into the license. Let me paraphrase it. The need for an MBET in that setup would be reviewed after 3 years, right? Okay. It didn't happen, but a review was done, I think, in 2021 or 22, I think it was late 21, if my memory serves me, by NERC. Mm-hmm. And I was asked at the time, and I was very clear in my mind, it's time for us to begin to look at winding up the bulk trader as we know it today, all right? All credible markets are bilateral, right? All. There's none without exception that is trilateral or quadrilateral, okay? They're all bilateral, buyer, seller, at some level or the other, whether it's distribution, transmission, or generation. You've got somebody selling a service, somebody buying that service at each of the 3 levels, right? So the bulk trader definitely has to begin to start rethinking. And indeed, if you don't, like I said just now, if you don't own the process, somebody will own it for you. So NERC has said to the market, for better, for worse, I think I have my thoughts about that, but NERC has said very clearly to 3 discos, Ikeja, Eko, and I think Abuja, guys, go out and negotiate your bilaterals. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe I wouldn't have done it that way, but it was bound to happen. So I can understand NERC forcing the situation, forcing people into thinking about, what is bilateral? What are the incidents? What happens with system operation? How do we contract for reserves? Who do we contract with? What will be the terms? So they are being forced into this. And again, it's what I said. If you don't own the process, we know what electricity market should look like. We are not there yet, but we should realize that NERC's first objective, NERC's first function under the Act is not per se regulation, it is market design. Mm-hmm. And we don't yet have that steady state market design, which means we are evolving. We will be evolving. And so NERC will be pushing various players in the market and maybe even bringing in new players into the market to say, look, guys, enter this market. We're going to license you, go and do this, right? Shake things up. So it will happen, and I think that already MBET needs to begin to ask itself, what should we look like, right? In the next 2 years, 3 years. If they're not doing that already, I'm sorry, but they've got something wrong. They need to be thinking about that and working towards that. They can't continue to hold people's contracts, right? That should be held by those people themselves. They can't continue that way.
I know we should, shut down the interview at this point, because we are that marker, but some interesting questions came in from the participants.
Yeah, let's hear them.
We can very quickly squeeze them in.
It's up to you. I can take another 10 minutes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So
not more than that, 10, 15.
Alex Akolo, from a legal and regulatory perspective, does this mean that the EPSRA 2005 will be totally ineffective in these states that make their own laws? Will there be a handshake between the state laws and NERC in 2 minutes? 1 minute, actually.
Second question answered.
Second
yes,
question.
No. I mean the part B of
okay.
of what Austin, you said?
Alex.
Alex, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Alex. So the second part of your question is easier to answer. The answer is yes, there has to be one, and I believe there will be one. Will EPSRA be totally ineffective? No. Don't forget, there are now conceptually two types of markets. The federal market. So you will have a NEC that I think will even have more and greater responsibilities now to focus on the federal wholesale market between generation that goes across state boundaries into distribution companies and entities within states. So you already have those PPAs, Transcorp, Ugeli, Egmi, Kainji, Jeba, the NIPP power plants, Azura, and all that. It will continue. NEC will continue to take responsibility for those under the EPSRA. What I think needs to happen is that, and I think is happening already, is that the EPSRA has to be amended to take account of this new situation and provide for how this new world that we are necessarily going into will unfold. Try to manage that process of transition.
Okay, so I've got a question here from, an anonymous attendee. That's how it's counts. Yes. The ability of states to actualize the intentions of the constitutional amendment and also the creation of viable state electricity markets, and also any conversation between the federal and states will be hinged on the repeal and or amendment of many provisions of the EPSRA in 2005. Without repealing or amending these provisions that give the federal government the powers over electricity transmission and distribution via NERC, NEMSA, TCN, REA, and other agencies, it will be difficult for the states to make laws that would catalyze private sector investment in the state electricity markets. Amending the EPSRA is the second step in the process of getting the states to deliver 24/7 power to their citizens. Yes or no?
I agree.
Fantastic. I wish he put.
I don't think we need to repeal. I think we need to amend, and I don't think we need to amend much. I think what we need to do actually is to inject, and there are very few of them. There are not many. Those provisions that give NERC the right to regulate distribution. If we state those powers to continue without prejudice to the power of states to make laws, we're fine. That's one side. The other side is NEC already, the EPSRA already has transitional provisions. If you remember, in fact, the whole of parts 1 and 2 of the EPSRA are about transiting from NEPA through PHCN to these successor companies. So the idea of transition is not strange to the EPSRA. We need to tack on another set of transitional provisions that go from NEC regulation to state regulation. That's one. The other thing is that we are not going to have 36 states going into this new world all at the same time. So there will be a residual default power that NEC already has to regulate distribution at state level, right? Which will continue for those states that choose to say, well, look, let me watch how it's going to go in Ondo, or let me watch what's going to happen in Kaduna or Edo or Lagos or Anambra or Enugu or whatever else, right? That is taking the plunge. Most of the states undoubtedly will want to see how it unfolds. Some will, I'm going in at the deep end, let's go, right? And we'll all watch, we'll all like to see them succeed, right? In one form or the other. But the bottom line is that more people come into the frame of being served by institutionalized markets and leave the hassle of being their own NEPA or their own PHCN or their own PHED. That's really what is most critical. How many people can we take out from auto or self-generation into an institutionalized and recognizable, credible market?
Eyo, thank you so much for making time to join this conversation. And to everyone who joined, thank you once again. And I'm just sharing a screen on the next session we have, same time next week, ending Nigeria's fuel subsidy regime, the why and the how. And it's with Neil McCulloch. He's a director with the policy practice, and he's just written a very important book on ending fossil fuel subsidies, the politics of saving the planet, and many of the issues or examples he used in the book from his work in Nigeria over the last decade or so. So hopefully you find the time to join us again next week, same time, as we take on this very important issue that must be addressed by the incoming administration, or we'll remain in trouble. Yeah, but Eyo, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
And thank you to all those who found time to join.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye now.